where he has been asking them really to open their hearts to him halfway through chapter 6. And then in 7, he's gone on to talk about the sorrowful letter, which must have been a letter he'd written to them prior. And now at the coming of Titus, chapter 7, verse 6, Titus has encouraged him, and he was depressed and sad, and he's comforted by the coming of Titus, because I take it Titus is saying, it's all right, they're not mad at you, and they're not grieving, and they're okay. And so verse 13, he has been comforted, and we rejoiced even much more for the joy of Titus, because his spirit was refreshed by you as well. So this must have taken place somewhere in the middle of Macedonia. Titus has found Paul on the way down towards Corinth, but he hasn't come to Corinth yet. So we take it 2 Corinthians is written somewhere in the middle of Macedonia before he finally gets to Corinth. We're about to also say that the letter to the Galatians, if you take the late date, and I'm giving you the late date, is also written directly after it. And when he gets to Corinth, he'll write Romans. So we have 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, probably within a 5-month period. And this is one of the powerful arguments that Galatians is a precursor or a dry run or a statement, brief, of what Romans is large and more detailed. Okay, let's look at chapter 8. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and his mind here is on his support for the saints. Do you remember that when they had the council in Acts chapter 15 in Jerusalem, remember they were trying to sort out table fellowship and kosher food and meats that were strangled and eating meat with blood in it and so on and so on. And the issue was, if Gentiles are coming in to the gospel kingdom, well, how will they live with Jews who also are there? And they said, well, they gave some instructions, but one of the things they said to Paul was, do not forget the poor. And we take it the poor are in Palestine. And where he is among the Corinthians, and he's come through Asia Minor and up through Macedonia, and maybe he's gone right out to Illyricum on the west coast. Yep. And because he says he's preached all the way to Illyricum in Romans 16. So he must have gone all the way to the end of the Via Egnatia, the road of the Ignatians, which is a Roman road, which is, yes, it's a Roman road. We need a stick, and then we have it. It's obviously a place where Paul has gone right out to the end of Illyricum, because he says so. We have no notion of that by his letters, nor have we by virtue of... Yes. Oh, yes. These great works that I've spent my life doing, making endless maps. If we're little, we can manage. So he's actually come up from Ephesus there, and he's come up round through Macedonia. And if you go to the end of this is a Roman road, you appreciate, which comes out of Brindisium, or it comes out of Neapolis. And this Roman road lets an army march all the way across, and it goes down. It also veers up to this section of Byzantium. But at the very end of this Roman road is the town of Illyricum. And in Romans 16 he says, I have preached the gospel all the way to Illyricum. But you don't know anything about that. You've never heard that in Acts, and you've never heard it in any of his letters, except Romans. Which means he says, I've got no more work. I've gone through the whole of this area, and there it is. So when he gets to Corinth and writes Romans, which Phoebe, the deaconess lady, takes to Rome while he goes on to deliver the money, which he's got saved up, and then gets, of course, in prison for a year and a half. He obviously is thinking he's finished. So we take it he has gone to the end of this Via Egnatia, this most important Roman road. Roman roads were the great the great thing they did to actually get themselves across the empire fast, very quickly. People think that Romans have bequeathed to us Roman law and Roman roads. That's the... Okay. Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God which has been given in the churches of Macedonia. So he's writing to Corinth in the south about the churches in Macedonia in the north. You appreciate that Macedonia is the old area of Philip of Macedon, who was Alexander the Great's father. So the Macedonians are a powerful warlike Greek bunch, but by this time they of course are not so. So he's saying that there is a great grace of God given to the church in Macedonia, that in great ordeal of affliction their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. This is a principle. The people who give are always the poor, and it's important to understand that. But he says, not in every case, but his issue here is, for I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging us with much entreaty for the favour of participation in the support of the saints. They just wanted to give their money for the rest of the brethren who were in this case, Palestine, because he's collecting for Palestine. And this, not as we had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. It's a very interesting distinction, isn't it? They gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by God's will. That is, if God himself convinced them that we were worthy people to do that. Consequently, we urged Titus that as he had previously made a beginning, so we would also complete in you this gracious work as well. So it must be that Titus has said to the Corinthians, we're collecting really for the Palestinian poor, brothers and sisters. So could you think about that? And and what Paul is saying is, I don't want to come and you have a rush around with a hat. I don't want that. I want you to quietly think this through, and on the first day of the week, put aside some money from your excess, and then it'll be there when I get there. But I don't want to come and talk money. Just as you abound in everything, in faith and utterance and knowledge, and in all earnestness and in love, we inspired in you, see that you abound in this gracious work also. I'm not speaking this as a command, but as proving through the earnestness of others the sincerity of your love also. What a lovely way to say that. What he's really saying is, through the earnestness and sincerity of the people of Macedonia, I'm going to prove your love to be the same. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, that you, through his poverty, might become rich. Now this is a text you commit to memory. This is one of those gems of Paul, where he is commenting upon the incarnation. What he's saying is that Jesus Christ laid aside his glory, laid aside his riches, and became poor. And he did that so that through his poverty, which he endured for our sakes, we might become rich with the richness that he himself has of his own nature. And I give my opinion in this matter, for this is to your advantage. Who were the first to begin a year ago, not only to do this, but also to desire to do it? So my opinion about this is that I'd like you to collect some money for these folks. But now finish doing it also, that just as there was readiness to desire it, so there may also be the completion of it by your ability. For if the readiness is present, it's an acceptable according to what a man has, not according to what he does not have. Now, isn't that a lovely way to state things? If a person is ready to contribute to something, it is acceptable according to what he has, not what he doesn't. So you never give pledges. You never pledge more than you have in your pocket, and you pay according to what you have today. Because it might be presumptuous to think you have it tomorrow.
So he's saying, I'm not trying to put you under an extortionate thing or to make you promise what you don't have. That's ridiculous. If you're ready to contribute, contribute according to what you have, not to what you don't have. For this is not for the ease of others and for your affliction. He said, wouldn't it be dreadful if this wonderful gift went to Palestine and it helped them, but it helped them by making you totally uneasy and with a massive debt. So what he's saying is, see what he's saying, he's got a theology behind this. His theology is, if God gives a surplus, then people can give out of their surplus. In other words, you're not meant to give what would cost your own family to starve. In other words, you keep your obligations where you are and trust God for what you have. When you've got a little bit left over, then that's within your hands to do with what you want, and no one will suffer in your household and in your own commitments. I mean, there's no point taking people on board your boat if they sink you. That's just how it is. It's what the EU is really saying to Italy, isn't it? Who's doing this beautiful work of saving people, but in actual fact they're flooding through the borders, and the EU are basically saying, stop. And the Italians are saying, no, 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 and they're saying, you must. In other words, what's happening is that you can't take in more than you can manage. Otherwise, you have taken others in at the expense of your own family, and that is not what is required. That's why Paul will say in another place, if you don't look after your own family, you're worse than an unbeliever. His understanding is, to put it in Karl Barth's language, neighbours near and neighbours distant. You always attend to the neighbours near because they are your immediate responsibility, and your neighbours distant you look at out of your surplus. There's lots of people who don't think that. The UN in particular. But that's beside the point, because the issue you have to always think about is, of course, and it's an important question in terms of inflation and wealth, is what you and I might think is enough in Australia would be stunning abundance in some other place. So you have to always be careful about your standard of living as to whether you would just maintain that. But what Paul is saying to the brothers and sisters here, where everybody's poor and everybody's scratching, is to say, give what you have and don't take on a debt you can't pay, because then your care of somebody else becomes a burden. So this raises an important question, that the care of others is not to become a burden upon those who you yourself are responsible for.
And how does this relate, if at all, to tithing?
I wonder if you could say how you mean that. Look, I mean, I'm not being tricky, but in what context do you mean?
Well, you just hear a lot about, oh, you're supposed to tithe from church, and the church takes care of it and gives it to those who need it, and minimum 10%. Very structured. Because in the Old Testament, they were giving 10%, but they're giving 10% to God.
I understand. They, of course, I think would say they've made a direct exegetical decision to say that if God called the people of Israel to tithe in order to care for the Levites who had no land to earn money, but gave their time to what God was doing on behalf and for the rest of the community, then they would tithe in order to actually do that. They will make a jump. Hi, Ben. So they'll make a movement from the idea of tithing. We're at 2 Corinthians 8:11, Benny. So in this case, they would say that's the argument that the church should do that. The difficulty is that there are a number of difficulties, I think. There's a principle here about giving out of your surplus, because not because you wouldn't give till it hurts, that's not the issue, but because it's the surplus you have when you've cared for your own. So God gives us responsibilities. I mean, a good example is children. If God gives us children, we need to care for them. Then our question is, nobody else can, nor should, and they are our stewardship to steward, and just as they are our business to feed them. Well, then we're not going to do something to someone else, for someone else, that's going to cost our children food in their mouth. So the first principle is that we've actually got responsibilities near, which we need to care for, rather than for some other reason, as in the case of the communities, we'll come to see it. The second major principle behind here is not giving away your stewardship. That's his whole point about don't make a debt, don't keep a debt. Now this is one of our great problems today. I mean, it's like putting money in a bank. If you put money in a bank, you throw your stewardship away. They steward what's yours. True, for an interest fee which they give, but you lose stewardship of God's blessing by banking money. These are days when there aren't banks and you're living from hand to mouth, and so I'm not arguing for a principle there. I'm simply saying that this is the situation, and what he's saying is don't give away your stewardship. So don't contract a debt to care for others, because that's eventually going to cost your own household, and that's not right. So that's his second principle, is there is a stewardship you have both of people and of capital, which you yourself need to keep. And that's the principle that Rog looks after you before anybody else will, if you know what I mean. Now, in that sense, and he might say I think he might say, it is my stewardship to care for my wife in a way that others are not going to have that by cutting me out of that. That's not right, because I've been given that. And similarly for yourself, you have a stewardship for him, which no one else shall get into your area of care. Right. On the other hand, now that's a stewardship of responsibility for one another. But you may have an excess where you can say we have a surplus and we can give this away to the benefit of those who are really stuck. Well, then we'll do it. The church won't, and some group of people who are not us won't, because they'll always use it for what they themselves think is where it should go. Now, that's why this is a very interesting situation. Here's an apostle actually saying, I'm collecting for the Palestinian brothers and sisters. Are you people in or not? Presumably Corinth said early on, we're in. Oh, yes, we'll do that. We're with you. In other words, he was the occasion of presenting a need, but they had the freedom to actually contract in or out. And they contracted in. And they contracted in presumably as a community. But he knows that the contributions come from individuals. So he wants them to say, I'm not giving a command about people giving. You freely contracted in as a community, well then it's up to your community to give what you feel you have to give. But he is saying, but with regard to each individual, they should give according to what they have, not according to what they have not. So he's actually implying, don't screw people for more than they can give, don't extract money from them, don't take a promissory note, and don't take a debt. Just simply let people give what they have in abundance. So you give out of what you can. And his point is, it should be free, otherwise your care of somebody else becomes a burden upon your own family. Now, all of us make this mistake over a wide range of areas. I mean, lots of us get interested in other people and other situations, and our families suffer because we do. Pastors are really good at this. They just care for everybody else except their families, and it's not easy to do. It's not easy to not balance that, or unbalance it, or keep it balanced, or do it properly. I don't think it's easy, but I think everyone has that problem, don't you? In fact, there are people who touch your heart, and you might favour towards them, and your own family might say, "Well," and they might say, "You didn't care for us," and a lot of people would say that So he's dealing with issues of stewardship, responsibilities. Stewardship of money in particular is yours to have. Use it while you have it, but don't give it away. And he's saying to the community at large, I think, don't screw people, don't lean on people for more than they can give. This is a very important issue, and it's very, very important in some communities and some cultures where people give publicly and then compete, pretty much. And so I think that's the principle. Now the tithing bit, well, does it come across from the old to the new? Not necessarily. You won't see anything the apostles ever say about tithing. Because a tithe was actually an ordinance of God, which was to say, set aside a tenth, because you've got to keep these people running. They've got to eat, and you guys have got land and they haven't, and that's my order. So I want you to kick off tenth for them, because you've got an earning capacity with your land that they don't have. But they are full on collecting wood and running the temple and running the tabernacle and doing sacrifices. And it's true, they can eat of that. I've provided for that. They have some meat, but their veggies and other things, well, you need to keep that. So I think that's a functional ordinance of the Old Testament, which I don't see in any example comes across to the New. It's a fairly late development, tithing. Yeah, probably. And it comes out of an idea, I think, to fix a percentage so that you can say to people, you can lean on people, up to 10%, which is the very point he's saying. Don't do that. If they've got an excess, let them give out of that, and freely. And if they, I mean, isn't that the whole issue of Ananias and Sapphira? They had land, they sold the land, and then gave less than the land was worth, masquerading as if it was all that the land was worth. Well, that was a trick. That was a deception. But it wasn't as if the apostles were saying you didn't give enough. You didn't give it all. Was it not in your hands to give or not to give? So Peter doesn't take them to task because of the amount, but of the deception about the thing. So, much as I know, I think, about that.
Why were they collecting for Jerusalem anyway?
Because the Jerusalem folks, because they were poor. The Palestinian church was a poor church.
Wouldn't they all have been
poor?
So why are they going right all the way back to Jerusalem?
Because they charged Paul not to forget the saints in Jerusalem. And I think he took it to task and said, not the saints, the poor. Could you... Because remember in other places, there's other places where Paul will actually say to the Gentiles, if you have benefited from, Romans, if you have benefited from Jewish promises of God, it's only appropriate that you respond and give back out of your wealth to them. So he obviously has a payoff between Jew-Gentile. There's a theology of giving in Paul which people think is quite complex, that he thinks the Gentiles are not to be exploited for the sake of Jews. No. But in the sense of saying, if the mother church is Jerusalem, once the gospel goes to Antioch, they start providing. Do you remember for the famine? Someone forecasted a famine in Antioch, and they collected money. Barnabas and Paul, wasn't it? Went south with money to Jerusalem and said, we've heard from the Lord there's going to be a famine. We thought we'd anticipate this and give you some coin. And they said, thank you very much. So presumably the situation in Palestine is much poorer than it is in the Gentile commercial great cities of commerce, I guess. And bear in mind there's an enormous passing trade in all these things because it's Rome. There's Roman military men running through. There's armies always on the move. Every hotelier has got his place full. Everybody knows that the Roman Empire brings loot because it's about Well, it's government service. It's government contracts fundamentally. It's road building. It's everything. I mean, when you've got an expanding empire like Rome and you're in a major city on a major highway, you've got opportunities that people in Palestinian backwaters, in the wadis of Jordan River, are not even seeing, let alone understanding. Bear in mind also that after Titus's sacking of Jerusalem in AD 70, it'll be even worse that they are. He says that verse 13, this was not for the ease of others and for your affliction. That is, he's saying, we're not asking you to give out of your surplus that others may just sit on their backside and rest. That would just be your affliction, but by way of equality. That's why people have thought Paul had a sort of a resident communism within him, that the whole idea was that it was about equality. But he says equality at this present time, your abundance being a supply for their want, that their abundance also may become a supply for your want, that there may be equality. Now this presumes a whole set of questions which moderns would have to consider. Is the rate of exchange in Corinth the same as it is in Palestine? Is the standard of living in Corinth different from Palestine? Are the Palestinians to give out of their surplus that the Corinthians may keep their olives? These sorts of questions are just so difficult to raise. And we're seeing the same thing with climate change, aren't we? We're watching whole issues of people trying to argue about those matters because there are lands that would rather burn their coal to advance, whereas the advanced countries are busily having... We have the astonishing luxury of thinking we might do something about it. They're saying, excuse me, we're just putting the next breath in our mouth. Coal or no coal, we couldn't give a flick. We need lights and electricity. And so those inequalities are actually something which Paul does not address as an economic reality, but he does address them with regard to the way the church should care for the church. And he's talking about equality. As it is written, he who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little had no lack. Now that is an amazing quotation from Exodus 16. You remember, when the manna from heaven fell, everybody was to gather whatever they could. And you might have thought that there's a rush on the thick places of manna to fill up our basket. What Paul is saying is, what God managed was, it wasn't a supply which you must go get. It was a supply which, when you went to get it, God would assure you that you didn't have too much, nor if you were old and infirm and a bit sick, that you didn't get too little either. In other words, what Paul is saying is, it's God's mind and will that people have enough and not too much. So he's actually drawn his understanding of the way Christians should live with regards to one another from the distribution of manna. He's saying when God sent the manna, nobody was to gather on behalf of somebody else and therefore charge a gathering fee. Right? All the entrepreneurs would know how to do this because you've got a free supply. It's coming from heaven. So some enterprising young 25-year-old with a fit body would run around with a bigger basket and collect more and then sell it. No, says God, that's not how it will be. Everybody should just pick up their basket and go out, and I guarantee you will not lack and you won't have a surplus. It'll just be right. Now what Paul is saying is, surely that's the mind of God about provision for one another. So he's drawn his theology of equality, as he calls it. Now notice he doesn't mean equality in the sense of all people are equal and therefore the same. What he means is that's the whole point about the manna. Some gathered little, some gathered much. But he who gathered little had no lack, and he who gathered much did not have too much. Now, that is a profound piece of information. What he's actually saying is God has taken care of the appropriateness of what each person shall gather to eat. Isn't that amazing? There's nowhere else in the world that ever happens, except when the manna falls. But what it does say is, it's not according to what you can gather. It's according to what God will provide for you as you go get it for yourself and your family. It's a very important text, verse 15.
Because when they did, people that tried to store the manna went off anyhow. See, you couldn't be entrepreneurial. Because
You could not, Ian, and that's what's so marvellous. Notice how God is dealing with people who He knows are wicked and will be entrepreneurs and will make a virtue for themselves of someone else's lack. It's law of demand and supply, they'll tell us. In actual fact, here is the text which tells you, no, it isn't. It's about a father caring for his flock. And his way is that he who gathers lots doesn't have too much. He who gathers little has no lack. You think, what is that? That's an amazing piece of double talk. But actually what it's saying is God is making sure you'll be all right. So an old infirm lady with her walking stick and her little basket says, I can go out and I'll have enough. Our Lord says I will. Oh goodness, I found a big pile here. Well, that's enough. And so you see what happens here. But this is what Paul. So Paul's theology is derived from the giving of manna, which is the provision of God for His people. So verse 16 is opening up now another question. Thanks be to God who puts the same earnestness on your behalf in the heart of Titus. For he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he has gone to you of his own accord. And we have sent along with him the brother whose fame in the things of the gospel has spread through all the churches. You might wonder, who is that? Who do you reckon that would be? Well, we'll read on first. And not only this, he has also been appointed by the churches to travel with us in this gracious work, which is being administered by us for the glory of the Lord himself, and to show our readiness, taking precaution that no one should discredit us in our administration of this generous gift. For we have regard for what's honourable, not only in the sight of God, but in the sight of men. That is, we're going to look right to God, and we're going to look right to men, and we've got a lot of money on board. So we're going to handle this pretty carefully. He says, we have sent with them our brother, whom we have often tested and found diligent in many things, but now even more diligent because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker among you. As for our brethren, they are messengers of the churches. Now you should read this in Greek, apostoloi, of the churches. In this case, ton ecclesione. What he's actually saying is these are apostles of the churches. So the word messengers is used here because they aren't apostles in the sense that Paul is appointed by Christ. They are apostoloi of the churches. In the scriptures you can have apostles of both sense. You can see that very sharply at the end of Romans 16. Where Paul actually refers to the apostles, junias, and he's making clear that these are the apostles of the churches. That is, they're the messengers, the authorised messengers of the churches. You should realise that that's an important issue to understand. In the context of which we're looking, we need to see that. You're familiar with the English word apostle, which translates the Greek word apostolos, and this translates a Hebrew word shaliach. A shaliach is, in this case, is this person is an authorised messenger. Now, shaliach has the ability from his master to negotiate contracts, although he would know his master's mind, and he has a power of attorney to sign. He can close a deal. So he can work in the name of his master. Anybody who works in your name because you're not there, but they have your authority to actually sign. So an apostolos is an authorised messenger of Jesus Christ. So these are the apostles of Jesus Christ. But you can also have apostles of the churches. And what Paul is saying is, I've got with me a whole lot of guys, well, some guys from different places, Thessalonica maybe, Philippi, from the Berea, from where we've just gone through this particular... So Paul's moved through these places, Neapolis and Philippi, Amphipolis, Thessalonica and Berea. He says each of these towns presumably has said to Jim, will you accompany Paul all the way to Jerusalem with our money? And Jim would have our money in a box, and this would be from Berea. And so Paul has got an entourage here of people who are, each of them is responsible to go back to Berea and actually say, I delivered our money, and here's the receipt. So Paul doesn't do it. He doesn't take any responsibility for that. Mind you, it's his idea. But they willingly said, we'll come on board, and in which case each town does that. Quite an important procedure, because it allows us to actually do that.
NIV has representatives
Of the churches, yeah. It's a right translation in the sense that they're sent, they're authorised, and they're not chosen by Paul, but by the churches. Yeah. This is the way the ancients did business. You can't work with an electronic chip now at that point, but what you do is you have to send a person who actually gets on board a ship with your money box and delivers it to the people in Jerusalem who thank you. This is from Berea, Mr. Man from Berea, and we write out, we in Jerusalem have got this, and thank you very much. And all the other people who were with Paul from Philippi and Amphipolis and those places would have said, yeah, the Berean thing got in there as well, so they'd have witnesses. The early church is neurotically careful about handling money, particularly monies of other people. And here's a good example of it. In an apostolic letter, here is the most clear example of the handling of money. Paul has just got his fingers right off it. And he said, I'm not looking after a box. The Berean men will look after the Berean box, not me. So he says, we have sent them with our brother, and we're confident that they are good friends, but also they are messengers of the churches, a glory to Christ. Therefore, openly before the churches, show them the proof of your love and of our reason for boasting about you. Presumably Paul said, the Corinthians, they'll have something to contribute. I'm sure of that. And he's got all these guys with him who've got their boxes. They all get to Corinth, and at Corinth Paul is actually saying, please, Corinthians, I'm telling you now by letter, quietly on the side, turn up with some loot. But I don't want you rushing around, as I'll just be embarrassed. So you can see what's happening here.
Was that Timothy with them? With Titus?
The person who is found diligent in many things. It's either Timothy, some people think it's Apollos, but I think it's more likely to be Timothy, or it may be Luke. We don't know. It's not easily understood. But obviously, it's a person known to Corinth, and we have no sense that Luke's that. So I'm thinking Timothy.
Wouldn't they be under risk of having their money stolen off them?
Yes, and that's why they travel in convoy, and they may well distribute it in their person, might be on their body. In fact, that may be the reason why there's more than one, that they haven't got it in a box. They've actually got it in big denomination coinage, and it's on their body somewhere, and not clinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, the carrying of valuables is a very difficult thing in the ancient world, and you do it, and that's why you need the entourage would be its own security. It's also Paul's own security as well. If you're not asking, I'm going on. Chapter 9. For it is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints, for I know your readiness. of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. Achaia, as you know, is the section beyond Corinth. So if this is Corinth on the join of these two sections, Achaia is this southern section of the Peloponnesian Peninsula of Greece. This is very famous, as you know, it's where Sparta was, and the Trojans. And Sparta, this has got great history, which we do towards the end of this course, perhaps. And what's important to see is that Achaia is this part beyond the Corinthian, opening into that section. But I've sent the brethren that our boasting about you may not be made empty in this case, that, as I was saying, you may be prepared. So part of his reason for sending 2 Corinthians is to say, I'm so comforted, Titus has come, thank you very much, it's been wonderful. But he's also saying, I also wanted to send you an advance statement about the coming of us. We're turning up with lots of people who are messengers at each church, and we've got money on board, and could you get yours ready? I think is what he's saying. I was saying you may be prepared, lest if any Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to speak of you, should be put to shame by this confidence. In other words, I've committed myself. I'd like you to deliver. So I thought it necessary to urge the brethren that they would go on ahead to you and arrange beforehand your previously promised bountiful gift. Look at the adjectives, previously promised and bountiful gift, that the same might be ready as a bountiful gift and not affected by covetousness. Now this is a very important principle. This is the principle which we see so operative in among our African brethren and other people, where people compete to seem to be giving more money. Jesus' teaching is let your left hand not know what your right hand's doing. So if you give, you just give. And nobody knows. Nobody knows. And his whole point is because there's 2 problems with it. The first is it would look like you're lifting your own self up. But there's another problem. People may become covetous and want to outdo you. And so you get this incredible sadness that happens in some countries among Christian people, where they actually have this sort of stand-up ding because he gave more than I did. And then people put in more, and so it goes. It's just terrible.
It says here, grudgingly given. He says there will be
Yeah.
ready as a generous gift, not as one grudging
Yeah,
gift.
that's right. Or for self-interest, you know? And that's why it's really important to understand this. The freedom to give is preserved by the privacy of the giving. Now this I say, he who sows sparingly shall also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully shall also reap bountifully. Now you've probably heard this one about tithing put many times. Give lots so that you can get back lots, which of course applies to your own self. So it's actually quite the reverse. What he's saying is, there is a rule. Sow sparingly, reap sparingly. Sow bountifully, you get back bountifully. He says, let each one do just as he's purposed in his heart. Notice the freedom. He's not afraid to encourage, but he always balances by saying, do it as you wish, not grudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. This is true to everything that you have, you know, in your life. You give it away as you wish, and do it happily. If you don't do it happily, don't give it. It's getting extracted from you some way or the other. And God is able to make all grace abound to you, that always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. As it's written, he scattered abroad, he gave to the poor. His righteousness abides forever. Which is a quotation from the Psalms, 112. Now he who supplies seed to the sower, bread for the food, will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You'll be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. For the ministry of this service is not only fully supplying the needs of the saints, it is also overflowing through many thanksgivings to God. So he says, you know, people will have their needs met, sure, but they'll actually do something else. They'll thank God so that this will give him glory. Because of the proof given by this ministry, they will be glorifying God for your obedience to your confession of the gospel of Christ and for the liberality of your contribution to them all and to all, while they also, by prayer on your behalf, yearn for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift, by which I think he means Christ. Now you can see how this man is motivated. This is what lets you inside Paul's brain. You get to understand his heart. What he's on about is he wants to see Christ thanked, God thanked. And the reason he wants that is because that's to God's glory. People who are thanking God obviously think he's arranged it, which he has, but he's arranged it through the liberality of these people. And these people have been free and they've been happy to give. And all these things are his principles for seeing how you could encourage people to freely give and to give liberally, but they need to give without burden. And at the same time, they'll not only meet the needs of people, God will be praised through it. Isn't that worth going? So that's his whole issue. It's a text that needs to be handled very well and not in the context of our current understanding of monies and exchanges and so
I
on.
notice he doesn't set a faith target.
No, he doesn't set a target. No, he does not.
So, am I reading correctly when he's saying that your reward and your gift and the things that you've given back are almost the intangibles?
Yes.
So he's not saying, look, if you give lots of money, you get lots of money back. This
No.
isn't some sort of...
No, it's about an increase in the harvest of righteousness.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and the gift is his son, and it's producing thanksgiving.
Yes, there's no self-interest here,
Yeah.
although there is a church interest. The community should expect to be blessed by their giving, but you don't apply it to the individual, lest he give for that reason. There's a few places in Scripture where you've really got to have a communal understanding of a matter as distinct from a private one, otherwise the principle goes wrong. You know, when we say each of us has got, if one of us suffers, we all suffer. Well, that you can experience suffering as a community, and that's only possible because you are one, in effect. And similarly, you can, and if one of us is glorified, we all are. He's one of ours, and so there's a near sense that he's one of our people. And in that respect, the community benefits, and he's pointing to the community benefit. And you're right, he's talking about an increasing harvest of righteousness. You will be enriched in everything for all liberality. This is why big-hearted congregations who give it away, they do get blessed amazingly as a community. But the minute you're taught to give in order to get blessed, the game's gone, because we've now begun to appeal to something inside you which is clean contrary to what Paul is saying is active here, which is people are recognising that they are members of the body of Christ, and this body of Christ is not just local. It's universal. And it's a form of loving each other. Okay, now with this last section of 10, he comes to something quite difficult and important for us, because he now returns to his opponents with reference to the fact that the Corinthians have got other voices in their ears who are saying that Paul is he's just such a meek dude, but when face to face, he's not. Well, now he wants to take that to task, and he mixes his metaphors here in a way I think we have to understand. I, Paul, myself, urge you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. In other words, this sounds all the wrong language, doesn't it, when you consider what's happening today? We are looking for people to be forceful, to be bold, to be leaders, pushers, movers, shakers, people who are exercising their will. You can do whatever you want. You can achieve whatever you wish, whether it's in, sport or whether it's in money or in career. It's all about your will, driving your will here. What Paul is saying is, I want to urge you not by any of this forceful stuff, but by the meekness and the gentleness of Christ. Now, why does he want to do that? Because that's how Christ has actually urged you. Jesus never pushes you around, ever. The Holy Spirit never. He is such a gentle spirit, if you don't give him the nod, he just disappears and shuts up. Sort of goes quiet. You think, come on, push back a little. No, he won't. Because, in other words, sometimes we get frustrated with God because we're saying, why don't you fight me a bit more? And the answer is, that's not how he does it. He draws you. He does not fight you. So in this case, Paul is saying, I urge you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I who am meek when face to face with you, but bold towards you when absent. Now that is sarcasm. What he's saying is the people who say, face to face, he's very meek. But when he's absent, he writes all these heavy letters, and he's very bold to sort of tell you what he thinks. He says, that's what they say about me. Well, I'll tell you what, I prefer to urge you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I ask that when I'm present, I may not be bold with the confidence with which I propose to be courageous against some who regard us as if we walked according to the flesh. So he says, now listen, you don't want me to come and be bold. If you want me to be a heavy dude, then I'm not going to do that. I'm going to come to you not boldly with the confidence with which I will go to them. Now, what is this actually saying? I don't know whether you've discovered this, but sometimes I use a stupid analogy, that if you were sitting in the Dakar, that's the little, what is it? It's a troika. If you're sitting in the troika of Stalin, right, and you're one of his children, and you're sitting in the trap, and the horses are ahead, and you're going down this beautiful Russian snow-covered thing, and you're holding your Kubidol, and you're a child of Stalin, and Stalin is your dad. He is the best dad ever, and he's wealthy, and he's got all these stuff, and you know nothing about what Stalin means to millions of others who are dying at his hands. Your experience of your father is that he's been terrific. He's just the sort of dad. He tells us stories, we laugh, we joke, we have a hamper with ham sandwiches, and we just live off the top of the range. Our dad surely cared for us. What a great dad we've got, called Stalin. Your experience of Stalin is the experience of a child who he cares for, and it's a genuine, true, real experience, and it's appropriate. If you are a citizen of Bolshevik Russia and you're finding yourself in a gulag because Stalin has arranged for your liquidation and some, then your experience is that he's a total B. And you think he's the most disgusting individual you've ever come across, and you hate his guts, and you're going to live for revenge, and he's wiped out your family and your farm and everybody you've ever known, and all you are left is yourself in a cold cell with a bit of rice, maybe. Right? Are these genuine experiences of Stalin? Yes, they are. Now, what Paul is actually saying here is, these enemies are going to find that I'm bold and courageous and very pushy. And I can be. And I can be because they are in fact my enemies. That is, their stance towards me decides their experience of me. Now that's true in all life. In every relationship you and I ever have, your stance towards a person controls your experience of that person, if they respond in kind. But if they don't, they rattle you. So that if you're very rude to somebody, and you are really rude, and they just absorb it and press on and care for you in a way that you didn't deserve, that is, they're being gracious and meek and gentle, then they undo your aggression. Because they're refusing to be controlled by you as to how you approach them. They're not giving back in kind. They're what Boan would have called ministering in the opposite spirit. Right. In which case, at that situation, you understand that Paul is actually saying this: your experience of me, Corinthians, I am going to make certain is gentle and meek, because as an apostle, I think there is no other way to deal with my brothers and sisters but to emulate Jesus Christ and draw you after what I think is true freely and as a gift, and keeping you free all the time. That's the sign of good eldership, good leadership, keeps you free. But he said, these other people, you don't want me to be bold with the confidence I propose to be courageous against them. You don't want to see that side of me, because it's not appropriate for you to see that side of me, no more than it's appropriate for Stalin's children to be locked up in a cell and lose their life at their dad's hands. That's not how they would have known their dad. And if they write history, our dad's the best. And if the Gulag men write history, their dad's the worst. The answer is that depends where you sit in relationship to a person. So I'm first introducing a principle, which is that in the world of men and women who are fallen, generally speaking, how you approach a person influences greatly what response you get back. If you're rude and aggressive, you'll get something that says, hey, unless they're people uncontrolled by your aggression. This is what the Martin Luther Kings understood. This is what the Gandhis understood. What they understood was, if you reply in force and in kind, you get nowhere. But if you do the opposite thing, Jesus Christ will open you doors every time. Paul is saying to the Corinthians, they're telling you he needs to be stronger, more virile, more a man, more a push. And he's saying, you don't want that. That's not the form of our experience together. That's not our relationship. You don't want to know me like that. Because everybody understands about their dad. Dads by a fireside who read you stories and have cups of cocoa with you in a mountain cabin while it snows outside are a very different affair to your own dad, who perhaps is a cop on a beat dealing with people who need to be clearly pushed around. People deal in different ways. I'm not arguing Stalin was a good operator on either score. I'm simply saying that principle's true. Now you've got to understand, this verse 1 and verse 2 are built on that understanding. He says it's appropriate for someone who's an apostle to be meek and gentle with the brothers and sisters, not pushy and manipulative and heavy. But he said, I can be heavy, and there are people who know me as heavy. Right? So there's a man, wasn't there, who was trying to trick Sergius Paulus in the middle of Cyprus. And Paul said, didn't he? You messenger of Satan, you'll be blind right now. And he was. And Sergius Paulus said, ooh, ah, and saw something. But Paul has the power and he has the authority and the clout just to declare the man blind, because he's been there himself. But it's important to understand that this is not a man who fiddles. This is a man who gets irritated by a girl who's got a demon on board, who keeps dancing around and saying, these people are the servants of the Most High God. Bop, 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 bop. And he says, I just got irritated. So I said, get out. And he finished their whole system. He blew up their commerce, and they got really itchy and scratchy. In other words, Paul's quite capable of being quite strong against the enemies of God's people. And that's important. But he said, you don't want me to be like that. And if they think that I should be like that with you, well, I'm reserving that for them. Can you see the way he's thinking here? Not an easy text if you don't have the picture. They think we walk according to the flesh. That is, they think we're going to be heavy dudes who'll push around and we'll be the movers and the shakers who actually press in on people and control us. They think we're controllers. Well, that's to think we walked according to the flesh, and we don't. But we do walk in the flesh, but we don't war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but they are divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. Now, fortresses are particularly important usage here. The word he uses implies a castle that is built for a defence against the incoming gospel. Everybody, when you preach the gospel, everybody's got defences which must be overcome. They're fortresses in people's minds that say, no, I won't hear that. And they're always to do, in my understanding, with their will. He says, well, our weapons are divinely powerful. They use the power of God for the destruction of fortresses. And he explains what these fortresses are. He says, we're destroying speculations, that is, people who are speculative are just making up their own minds about what might happen. You know, how many times have you heard that sort of questions? What happens if we find there are people on Mars? Will Jesus have gone for them, died for them as well? Well, I think we should wait until we find there are people on Mars, but or there are some who wish to go there. But it's important to understand that these speculative questions can keep you hopping for years and years and years, because people are just keeping the questions running because they've got a fortress, because they're appreciating something is beginning to touch them and they're holding you at bay. Paul says, we have weapons of warfare that destroy those fortresses. Speculations and every lofty or high thing raised up against the knowledge of God. In other words, that's what the fortresses are there for. They are raised up against knowing God. Most people, or all people, do not wish to know God. They don't, because they understand inherently it's going to be something which will take down their own life. It will be the end of their life as they know it. And so they raise up a fortress. They have speculative ideas, they have lofty things. He doesn't say what they are, but they are raised up against the knowledge of God. So how does he understand this? He's saying, we are warriors, and the weapons of our warfare are not fleshly. We're not pushy people. We're not giving back the same kind they give to us. But what we do is that we have weapons that are divinely powerful. They're the power of God for the destruction of fortresses raised up against knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Meaning, what are we taking captive? Ideas, thoughts, things of people's minds. And we're taking them captive to the obedience of Christ. So what's he actually saying? Our aim, he says, in every person we meet is to make sure that their thoughts obey Christ. And they even think it right. It's a matter of, there's a man who wrote a book in the late 1960s, so 59, somewhere there. It was a Pan book, and it was called Battle for the Mind by Richard Sargent. And the battle for the mind was, he was dealing with the issue of communism and brainwashing, but actually what he was understanding was, the issue about brainwashing was, it was designed to take away your resistance to your will, which opened up your mind. And he said that the battle is for people's minds. Whether he's right or not, I don't know, but Paul has a similar theme here. What he's saying is, what people think, we want them to obey Christ with their thinking. Now, he'll say this in another place in Philippians 4:8. Whatever is true, whatever is good report, whatever is lovely, think on these things. So, and he'll actually find that. And it's a very important thing to understand, because if you set your mind on other things, you soon start to lose your place as a Christian very quickly. I find that to be the case. And so in this case, he's saying we're taking every thought captive, and we are ready to punish all disobedience whenever your obedience is complete. So he said, if they think we're weak, I'll tell you what, we'll punish everything that's wrong about you whenever your obedience is complete. See what he's done? We're not unpowerful, but we're not punishing anybody until their obedience is complete. And then we don't need to. So his whole understanding is, I'm looking for your obedience to me as an apostle. I'm not welshing on that. I'm not going back on that. I insist that will be the case. But if you think I'm going to push people round till I get it, forget it. I do it through meekness and gentleness. Now this is a very important idea. If you want people to obey you, deal with them meekly and gently. And the minute they say, such a lovely thing, I think I'll just do this, and you think that is called obedience. Obedience is when people do what you want. Or more particularly, they obey your person. Different issue. They may do what they want, but it's what you would think they should anyway. See where we're going here? So this is a most unusual perception of leadership, of how to have a strong language about obedience, but a very unusual way to get it, like Jesus did. If you see Jesus against his opponents who deal with him in the flesh, he is tough. Really tough. I mean, he's making scourges and driving people out of temples, and he's very angry. He's prepared to be quite angry. You've made my house, Father's house, a house of merchandise, and he doesn't mince his words. But with others, he is drawing them to obey him. And when they freely obey, well, then he understands that's the form of obedience I only ever want. The only obedience you want out of anybody has to be free for them, and then it's obedience to you. And that's how we work it with our children and our relationships and our friendships. We do that by actually saying, is that the case? And that's what leads to harmony. That's what we see every time we meet together perhaps, and somebody stands up and sings a song and everybody shuts up. Nobody says, hey, what are you doing? They just hear the song. They yield an obedience to the song. And then the person sits down and somebody else talks and we obey that. And this meekness which works means everybody can find their place and they have an environment which is unthreatening. They don't have to make their space. They don't have to say, listen to me. They don't have to do that. They just arc up, and then people get it. Now that's what Paul is describing about charismatic gifts. One has a psalm, it's hymn, a spiritual song. It just goes, it flows from him to her, to him to her, them, the little kid here. And as you watch it run around, it's very meek and very gentle, but it's obedience. We've always associated obedience with something that's heavy. It's actually the other way about in the Christian world. That's why a lot of people don't see it. They don't understand what they're seeing. So he said, I'll tell you what, we'll punish you all very heavily when your obedience is complete. And we won't have to. So he said, we're not too fussed about it. We're not afraid to talk the language, but we're not going to do it that way. Lastly, he says, you are looking at things as they are outwardly. If anyone is confident in himself that he's Christ's, let him consider this again within himself, that just as he is Christ's, so also are we. Now this opens the door to the question, if you think you're something, you should also understand so are we. And even if I should boast somewhat further about our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for destroying you, see it? There's my style and image again. The authority of a dad is to have authority with his children to build them up, not to destroy them. Well, then his authority will work. They'll feel it was a fabulous authority. It always built us up. What a wonderful authority to have someone who's always going to build you up. You'd simply say, but is it an authority? Of course. But it's for the building up and not for your destroying. Now he's going to go on to say, I'll run you straight there because I'm done for time. Look at verse 16 of chapter 11. Let no one think me foolish. If you do, receive me as foolish, that I may boast a little. That which I'm not speaking as the Lord would, but as in foolishness. So he's departing from his thing. Since many boast according to the flesh, I'll boast some too. For you being so wise, bear with the foolish gladly. Meaning, that's just sarcasm, straight sarcasm. For you bear with anyone if he enslaves you, if he devours you, if he takes advantage of you, exalts himself and hits you in the face. There's the big five. If you could apply those five to anybody you know, they're not for you, they're against you. Now what Paul is saying is, these are people who destroy you. They don't in any sense build you up. Well, he said, I do not wish to seem as if I would terrify you by my letters. So his whole point is, they say, well, he's a big note when he writes, he's heavy, isn't he? The answer is, I didn't set out to write heavy things. I set out to state things as I was seeing them. See, here's a problem, isn't it, for all? It's a problem for all Stalins as well. If Paul had said to them, look, it doesn't matter if you obey me or not. I'm just a brother. I'm a nothing here. I mean, goodness me. He doesn't say that. No way. He's strong. He states how he thinks he sees himself. He thinks he's a messenger of Christ, authorised. You better listen up. I've got something to say and I matter. You know, he expects that. But he doesn't have to push it so that he sells himself, but he does push it to sell his Christ. He says, I've got a master and you can't ignore him. Therefore you can't ignore me. Simple as that. So he does say that, but then he acts as if he doesn't have it, according to the people who are watching, according to the flesh. They say, he's hopeless. Hardly says anything when he's there. He's very meek. But when he's away, he writes all this heavy stuff. And the answer is, both are true, and true at once. Because when you are away, he's stating those things he wants them to consider about himself while he is not there. You see why? Because he's speaking of himself in absentia. If he was in the front saying, I am the greatest, come on now, then they would say, oh, no way, you're just selling yourself. But can he speak truth by letter, which he can't speak face to face without compromising his meekness and gentleness? Yes, he can. We'll see how it goes. We do that, don't we? If I said to you, we should obey Christ, he is our master and our God, you'd say, this is heavy. He doesn't seem to say that to us. I say, yeah, but I'll say it to you on his behalf when he's not here. So that when he is here, and when the Holy Spirit begins to move upon us, you'll be soft. In other words, there are things that can be said on behalf of someone in absentia, which are true, which they would never say in presence because they would be misread by their style. You get it? Important idea. Never forget we're reading letters, not hearing Paul direct. Very important thing. That's why this is a very, very helpful letter. This letter is opening to us a most amazing thought. It's telling you how he writes, and you would say, this man really takes himself seriously, does he not? Indeed he does. If you said, you're not going to mess with this dude, the answer is no, you're not. If you hear his letters right, you're not. Is he like that? No, he's not. And that's what everybody misunderstands. When I was a young man in Melbourne, Billy Graham came to do a crusade. And I happened to be on the team. And I was amazed to see Billy Graham sitting in a corner, quiet as a mouse, such a gentle man. When he preached, he's a different man. But that's important to understand. He had a great humility in person and a great softness. But he was a very authoritative evangelist, even though he was preaching very much the love of God. But it's important to understand that you often see people appear quite differently to how other people speak of them. I don't think you should be too fazed by that. I think you can speak in absentia some things you can't in present. We do the same, don't we? So, we should stop here tonight because the next section is taking us into a place where he's going to say what he really does think of these people who are actually commending themselves. But it's 9:10. So tonight, got any questions on this text? We're into something quite profound in this man. Paul is not an easy read because he does live differently to how he writes, not because he's inconsistent, but because there are some things you say by letter that you could not say face to face. But they're both true. You've only got to see this if you read love letters. I don't know if you've ever done this, but someday you should read the love letters of Dietrich Bonhoeffer to Maria von whatever her name was, large German word. Right. And when you read, there are things you can write to a beloved that is very difficult to say face to face. And what they discuss is quite interesting. Quite interesting. And the things that Bonhoeffer does not take up. I mean, he's 38, she's 19. And there's things he doesn't take up. It's very interesting. So, and you can see that there are people who've done a lot of their courting at a distance or by letter, and you'll find there are things you can write which either would sound a bit corny face to face, or a little bit too pushy, or a bit too frontal, a bit too, I don't know what to do with that. Anyway.
Like saying getting away with it in a letter. You get away with a lot more.
Yeah, and also you're forced to express yourself as to how you really feel in a way that you would never say face to face, because your language of talk is direct there, whereas your language of letter is fractionally indirect. It's about putting yourself in print. It's simple as that. It's the difference between teaching somebody and writing a book. It's a very different business, and you soon see it as soon as you try and do it. Our dear Father, we worship you tonight as somebody who has drawn us into relationships which are, we wouldn't say complex in the sense of odd, but we would say are finely tuned and very wonderfully balanced. There are things you could say to people, Father, about your house and about Solomon's building and about how you would cause your name to dwell and how your heart would be towards that building when people prayed, which if you were direct and present wouldn't be necessary, because we just talk to you. We'd like to ask you to give us wisdom about the way we read this man's letters, and why it is that you have given us the letters of Paul when we couldn't know him in the time that he lived, because we didn't live then either. And we'd like to pray that you would teach us how to read letters. We'd also like to ask that you would help us to understand the man in the way that he does write things which sound so strange, but he is being so careful not to be drawn into a response to the opponents which yields his truths away, so that he talks their language and not his own. Help us in this. Help us to understand this. Help us to know the meekness and gentleness of Christ is astonishingly powerful to those who love him. But to others it's nonsense, it's weakness, and it is to be rubbished and not valued at all. Help us to walk in the flesh, but not according to it. Give us this grasp and clarity. We ask it in Jesus' name. Thank you. Amen.